Welcome to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. I'm Tracy Chernoff, and I've spent my entire professional career in HR. Each week, we'll explore the delicate balance between people and business with the aim to reconnect the two and create meaningful outcomes. Listen in as I share my own experiences, challenge the status quo, and chat with guests from various industries about our mission to bring the human back to human resources. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here for another week. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe whether you're listening to the podcast or watching it. And I have to be honest, this is the third time that I've done this intro because I've had so many technical issues. So I hope that I sound like my usual self, but if I don't, that's why. But nevertheless, I'm really excited for this week's guest because he is a colleague of the cause, which is a term that he coined in the first mistake that I made with the intro. And now I'm excited to introduce him again, the third time for this recording, but obviously the first time for you. David is the head of procurement at Logitech, one of the world's leading manufacturers of computer peripherals and software, and probably a company that you've heard of before and that you are actively using in your day to day. They have more than 8,200 employees, over $4 billion in assets, and did $5.32 billion in revenue over the past year. David's main priority as a procurement leader is to ensure Logitech and the wider corporate sector can deliver real progress toward equality via their supplier spend, which is a core value for Logitech and a personal passion for him. Currently, only 6.1% of the trillions of dollars spent annually by U.S. corporations go to Black, women, and underrepresented suppliers, despite our best efforts to increase supplier diversity. Logitech has partnered with Gender Fair to launch the Coalition for Gender Fair Procurement with the simple aim of leveraging the multi-trillion-dollar spending power of corporate procurement as a lever to provoke urgently needed progress toward gender equality. David has worked at Logitech for over 10 years and has previously held management roles in finance at the company. David, again, thank you so much for joining the podcast. As you mentioned, we are colleagues of the cause, and I'm just really excited to have you on the podcast this week.
Thank you, Tracy. No, it's a real pleasure to be here, even third time round. Really pleased to be here. Thank you for having me. Excited for
Of
our podcast.
course. Of course. You can come around for a fourth time too, but hopefully we don't have to do a fourth take of this intro. Luckily, we were only 2 minutes in, so it's pretty easy to replicate the magic that was happening before I had to stop recording. Um, One of the things that I really want to preface here, and I know that we talked about it before I hit record the first time, which is that I've said on the podcast before that one of the best ways that we can, as consumers, influence business and the way that businesses make their decisions is by using the one piece of leverage that we have, which is our wallet. And that through our consumerism and the way and our consumer behaviors, we can influence business decisions. And the same goes for what we've seen with employee demand and how employees have changed the pace and the scope of business decisions throughout COVID and today. So can
Yeah.
you walk us through where this all started for you and how because I know that there is a magical story there about how this became a passion of yours.
Sure. So I'll start with some high-level context around this, Tracy. That will then lead into kind of my own personal angle a little bit, I think, really,
Mm-hmm.
and then sort of finish off to directly answer your question about how can we really make a difference here? How can we make large companies move? So I think first of all, the context. The UN Sustainable Development Goals were created in 2015. They set targets for 2030. Now that felt quite a long time away at the time. And
Mm-hmm.
these were really bold goals that for the next
Mm-hmm.
15 years, we really need to make big changes. Remove gender inequality by 2030, ensure inclusive economic growth by 2030, and many, many others, really bold goals. And now we're sat here in 2023, over halfway through that kind of 15-year time period, and we're actually on target to miss a lot of those SDG goals.
Mm.
The time to act, bold action, really fast, bold action is now. Even on gender equality specifically, the World Economic Forum research recently suggests that we're over 100 years away from achieving gender equality, even
Wow.
though the SDG goal is only 7 years away. There's not a
Wow.
single country that has yet achieved gender equality. So I think, in brief, as a context, there's a lot that needs to be done. And where this can really impact large corporations is large corporations are uniquely positioned to do something about this. with their brand, their global sort of societal resonance, frankly, their scale. Like they employ millions of people across the globe, have trillions of dollars of revenue. How can we as consumers or we as society make them move, or how can we make them want to move? And so I think that's some sort of context around it. A personal level for me is that working in procurement, it could be all too easy for me, I think, to fall into a trap of thinking procurement is about effectiveness and supply relationships and savings. I could easily be thinking, what am I actually even doing in my career for impact to society? I'm saving money for a big company. And on one level, that's true. And I think sometimes I'll be thinking I could at least go and do that for like a struggling NGO somewhere. But I think the way that I rationalize that is if you can orchestrate these large corporations to move on all those topics I just went through, whether that be internally at your own company or externally at others, if you can do that in your role, and I try and do that in my role, the impact I can have towards these really important goals is far more in this current hot seat, physically and virtually, I sit in around procurement at Logitech. I can have way more impact towards these causes there than I could if I woke up one morning thinking, do you know what I should be doing? I should be working for a struggling NGO. That would be really great and rewarding, but there's so much impact that can be done in large corporations.
Right.
So how do we make the move, and what's sort of going on in that space? I think we're at a really interesting time around this. That I was reading some research only recently, Tracy, from the Edelman Trust Barometer. It's been around for a few years, and it really assesses where does society see trust and see where action needs to come from around some of these really important topics for environment and society. And the interesting finding from that is that actually corporations are the most trusted source of action around this, more than governments, certainly more than the media, which isn't surprising, but even more than NGOs, actually, that society
Wow.
trust that corporations will act on this. I think when you also look at millennials and Gen Zs, millennials are entering leadership positions now. Gen Zs are entering the workforce. They're both really important consumer generations that corporations need to make sure that they're aiming towards. They really are following through actions after their words around we don't want to work for a company unless it's really driving forward some of these aims. We're certainly not going to buy products from some of these companies that are driving forward these aims. So I think to summarize all that, really, like I say, corporations have a huge potential to make an impact to wider society. We're at a really exciting time that wider society expects and trusts, open close quotes, trusts that they're going to act, and do so authentically. And I think we'll even reward them for doing so. So I think that's the sort of magic place we're in now. I think that
Hmm.
stakeholder capitalism, they're all kind of merging into one. Society is telling large corporations, we want you to act on these causes. And if we do, it'll actually be in the interest of your bottom line too. We will support you as a business. And that's really exciting because I think that's a really rich climate for decisive action. Because, like I said at the top, boy, do we need it because we're 7 years away from the SDG goals, and we're not going to hit many of them. And gender equality, particularly, we're miles off. So I think
Hmm.
there's cause for optimism with all of what I've just said. Really, hopefully, Tracy.
I agree. I totally agree. You know, it's interesting because in my master's program, which I completed in 2020, um, we learned a lot about, or we talked a lot about, maybe it's less learning, more discussion based, equality versus equity, and that equity can create more opportunities versus equality because equality can at some level like it's like how do you measure equality versus like how do you, measuring equity like enables like a more quantitative approach. I'm very loosely translating this, but there is a pretty significant difference between equity and equality because equity is about like equal access to opportunity, I guess, just in summation, whereas equality is saying that all involved are treated the same in essence. Again, is there a difference when it comes to what you do, in terms of like driving gender equality, equality across the supply chain? Is there a reason why it's equality versus equity, or is it kind of just all used within the same breath in the same way?
Yeah, now, do you know that's a really interesting point, isn't it, Tracy? And I'm a procurement guy. I'm actually even an imposter in procurement. I come from a finance background, so I'm a finance guy that became into procurement. I was sort of rapidly doing learning and quick revision on a lot of these topics, and a really nice visual I saw that described the difference really nicely, that I'm sure a lot of your listeners have seen too, was the idea of a fence that only the tallest person could look over, and then there was another couple of shorter people. And the
Like
idea
me.
was, okay, well, let's give everyone a stool. That's equality, right? We'll give everyone the same
Mm-hmm.
size a stool. That meant that the second tallest person could look over, but still not the shortest person. And then it said, well, equity is giving them equal access to that view, as you said. And I think the
Right.
shortest person had the biggest stool. The next person had a shorter one, and then the tall person, didn't need one at all. So I think that was a really nice visual for me as a sort of procurement guy coming to some of these topics with fresh eyes. A really nice visual. Um, so that sort of described it to me. I think what we're ultimately looking to do, and certainly around some of the initiatives we're carrying out around equality, it's kind of, we don't get into too much detail about equity versus equality. A lot of the specifics of one of our initiatives is really looking to make sure that, like I say, large organizations have a huge potential impact in the world. When you
Mm-hmm.
look at progress towards gender equality, the UN have it on sort of social lens, political lens, legal access, and then economic. It's economic that is miles off. It's economic, particularly, that's a long way off. So what we've really looked at
Yeah.
is, are our organisations, Logitech, other network partners, suppliers, etc., are they living up to the UN Women Empowerment Principles? The UN Women Empowerment Principles are the basic fundamental principles around, this is how you can develop equal economic empowerment, get that gender parity when it comes to economic empowerment. That's the sort of framework that we've used with GenderFair, our partner. Our organisations living up to the UN Women Empowerment Principles? And some steps of it can be really simple. Like, some of it's quite foundational. Some of it's around, do you have ERGs? Do you do philanthropy? Are your policies and processes family friendly, gender fair, etc.? And when I say simple, what I really mean by that, Tracy, I guess, is, if you as an organization and if your leaders care about these topics, you can decide that pretty quickly. If you and I are leaders of our own consulting group or whatever, we can be on a Zoom call and say, hey, Tracy, do you know, I really think we should have an ERG group for this. Okay, yeah, let's do that. That sounds great. Or same with policies and procedures. They're really
Mm-hmm.
important. The hardest one that you see most companies struggle with is women representation in leadership positions, in board positions, etc.
Right.
That takes a bit longer to get to. But the secret is, I think, I would imagine, if you looked at the numbers, if companies aren't doing the things I mentioned, the kind of easier foundational steps, ERGs, fair policies, making sure it's a really sort of non-misogynistic, very open and friendly company, etc., authentic company. If you're not doing that, you'll never get equal representation at leadership. I think that's the foundational steps to get to that leadership position. So certainly with GenderFair, where a lot of companies struggle is that leadership representation points, but you'll never get to that unless you're doing some of the really important foundational work.
Right. It's interesting. One of the things I think we had initially spoken about when we first connected was this idea of, what could be borrowed from the environmental cause. And I think of CSRs, or corporate social responsibility efforts. For those who don't know what CSR is, corporate social responsibility is typically when we see companies say, okay, we're going to commit to zero emissions, or we're going to commit, or, we're going to commit to ensuring equal pay, or whatever that is, right? Like, but most of the time I see it comes down to environmental causes,
Yeah,
which is, I think, where we had initially discussed this point. What takeaways are there from the environmental causes that we've seen over the last, I don't know, near 20 years, since the
yeah.
environmental causes have become more of a focus?
We thought about this a lot, actually, when we were sort of really deciding what can we do around equality and how can we have the most impact as Logitech, as me individually, and as a procurement team. And I think that's a really important point, that when you look at a lot of topics around equality, a lot of them are what I'd call kind of floor level controls or measurements. They're sort of basic levels that you absolutely cannot go below this. They're a floor that you cannot go below. and they're really important, and they're absolutely something you should do, and they're around human rights and slavery in your supply chain, child labor, all those sort of
Mm,
topics. And that's really
yeah.
important. You absolutely should be doing that. But if you just think about the simple maths of it, like we said earlier on in our chat, Tracy, we're 7 years away from our SDG goals. We're miles off hitting them. Will making sure that we're not going below a really bad floor level, will doing that help us achieve the SDGs? And the obvious answer is no, because we need positive change. We need something a bit more aspirational than that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think when we were thinking about this, those floor metrics are really important. You can't forget those, of course, but we need something
Right.
more aspirational. We need these kind of bold ceiling levels that we want to burst through. And when you think about environment, a lot of companies, if you ask them when are you planning to be net zero, they'll know the answer to that. Whether they follow through with it or not is another topic, but they'll know the
Right.
answer to it. If you ask them, okay, when are you going to be gender equal, they won't have that same sort of they won't have that same immediate answer. So I think having an equality goal that's aspirational, which tallies nicely that you can't go below these floors, and we want you to be really reaching towards an aspirational goal. I think that's really important because we need aspirational action. Um, and then with that sort of aspirational goal, there's absolutely importance again, a bit like net zero, that everyone knows what that means. It's a united
Mm-hmm.
goal. It becomes very common parlance between anyone in a network, departments in a company, suppliers, clients, whatever it might be. When are you going to be net zero? We need that same ambition around when are you going to be gender equal, or when are you going to be have equity on various other angles of it. I think we need that aspirational element. So aspirational metrics and that collective sort of understanding towards we're all aiming towards that same target. Um, that's very common in the environmental cause. It's less common in
Mm-hmm.
inequality, and I think it'd be really powerful if we did get better at having this kind of understood aspirational goal for all of us.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, hey, this is all great news for me to hear as a woman in business. I have personally worked in some environments that leave a lot to be desired for equity and equality across all platforms. But luckily, I'm not in that environment now. Um, However, one of the things that I think, at least in the US, that can help are some of these pay transparency laws. And I think we're seeing this across the globe. Of course, it's not just the US that enacts pay transparency, but in specifically in the US, especially in California and New York, there's this requirement to publish salary ranges, and that it has to be, reasonable, and a range that, is, again, whatever reasonable means, but a range that folks can aspire to achieve at the top, but also don't fall below. And what's interesting is that in California specifically, they're requiring EEOC reporting. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is requiring reporting by demographic, gender, et cetera, with regard to pay as part of this law, which certainly can help. I always say that if it's not going to be a company's, values set, like Logitech, for example, that's driving
Yeah,
progress forward, it's going to be regulation from the government. And it's usually one or the other. So, I'm really proud of what Logitech is doing to make these changes, especially considering the billions of dollars that we're talking about in influence that your company has. Now, with that said, what can, if there's a listener today who's working for a business, let's say in, mid-size, maybe they have 1,000 or so employees, maybe they're not this huge, 8,000 or more employee sized company, how can they make the same type of difference? What kind of influence can they have, whether it's on the supply chain or even on their company internally? What can they do?
yeah, yeah. No, great question, Tracy. I think the short single sentence answer to that, of course, is we can all do something. None of us can do everything, but all of us can do something. And ultimately, kind of in what I was really trying to do for myself in my role and Logitech is what is my something? What is my something? What is Logitech something? And everyone, I think, really needs to ask themselves that question. What is your own personal something around this cause? Maybe it's driven by your role, your personal passions, or where your organization sits in a particular industry or vertical or whatever. And I think if I answer that question on behalf of Logitech and myself, I think when you think, well, what is Logitech something? around all of these SDG causes, be it environment, equality, etc. It's it should be a relatively simple question to answer with a bit of thought, really. Logitech, we're consumer electronics, as you said. When you look at environmental issues, I've just held it up there. Plastics is a really big topic for us.
Yeah.
Circularity of plastics, using recycled plastic, etc. That's a really hot topic around our product, as is the carbon impact of our product. So they're really big topics in environment. When you ask yourself, okay, around social topics, what is Logitech something? Where does that brand resonate? Where does what we do have a real impact? What topics can we really try and make a difference on? And if you think there, really ultimately we design and engineer consumer electronic hardware. Those designers and engineers are kind of the IP of our company. They're the intellectual property of Logitech. That's our DNA really as a design and engineering company. STEM, I mean, you could say, Tracy, really, I
Mm-hmm.
guess that's sort of screaming gender straight away, isn't it? That there's gender issues in
Yeah.
STEM.
Oh, yeah.
Logitech as a tech company speaking out about that can have a real resonance. When you look at our verticals, gaming is one of our biggest verticals. Gaming again has been a very gender unequal industry ever since the sort of birth of modern console gaming. There's something again that our name can resonate there. Digital inclusion is another topic for us. So I think they're all the sort of things that we really touch on. So whether you're small, medium, or large size organization, whatever industry you're in, whether it's a geographical thing or wherever, ask yourselves what is your something. And I think I would encourage all of your listeners to ask themselves that at their organization, in their role. And that's going to be slightly different for everyone. I think some of the social topics are very universal, and we all need to work towards those. But everyone will have something that comes out of that thought
Mm-hmm.
about where can my role in HR, finance, sales, whatever it might be, and my industry and organization, what's my something? Work that out and then go do it. I think it's probably the simple advice because the world needs that bold action right now.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. It made me look down at a quote that I wrote from you when we first spoke, which was make sure the impact on the world that we have is a good one. And it's true. I
Exactly.
mean, there's no requirement in business size to make a great impact on the
No,
world or even to be a part of a business. Like you can make a great impact on the world as an individual.
exactly. Yeah, I think even on a personal level, I've been very lucky, really. Like I grew up in a peaceful Western European country, had so many privileges, courtesy of my skin color, my gender, etc. And that's just the way it is. But I think the most important thing about how I live my life now, personally and in my professional career, is separate to all of that. Really, it comes from that comes from the values that were instilled in me, comes from my sort of personal wish. And it's a bit like I was saying earlier on about you can find a positive impact in whatever role you do. I'm a procurement guy for a big company. That screams saving money for the man, and it kind of does do that. but you can do a lot of really good stuff too. And I think when you do that, it can make your job so rewarding, and ultimately, aspiring to have that positive impact, leave the world a better place when you leave it than when you entered it, really. And all of us can do that, no matter what your role is or where you live or whatever you do. I think we can all do that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love that. And, you know, as you were sharing, it made me think about what date I told you this episode was going to come out. And now I'm thinking we should put this out on Equal Pay Day, which is March 14th. And it happens to be a Tuesday, which is when my episodes go out. So I think I'm going to bump
Do
this
it.
episode right up. Yeah. I think I'm bumping it up from June,
Let's
which
do
is
that.
great. And yeah, I'm doing it. I'm going to go for it. So we can, considering the frame of reference that we've been discussing these topics in, I think it makes a ton of sense. I mean, equal pay day, everyone talks about it, right? I think about last equal pay day. And I like, candidly speaking, as a podcaster, I hate to say this makes me nauseous, but thought leader in the HR space, whatever that is, HR influencer, whatever you want to say, I really don't go for the gimmicky posts. Like it's, for example, I have a newsletter. It's Black History Month right now. This is when we're recording. And I talked about how History Month, like what it makes me think about and how I am impacted by the understanding of what Black History Month is meant to represent. And I don't post that on LinkedIn. And I'm sure that there are some people who are like, well, why isn't Tracy posting during all of these awareness months or, things like that. And
Yeah.
it's not because I don't care about it. It's because I don't want to contribute to a gimmicky discussion about, an awareness month. For example, Equal Pay Day, March 14th, last year, all of these posts, it was amazing. All of these posts on LinkedIn, everyone's like, Equal Pay Day, celebrate Equal Pay Day, make sure, that there's gender equality. And yet, like the following week, there was an article about businesses who had been sued by women in their companies for not having, fair pay compared to their male counterparts. Just, very
Yeah.
generally speaking, because I don't remember which company it was, but and then I thought, like, what good is it to post about these things if we're not taking action? And so that's where, like, these episodes are where I'm like, I'm putting words to the mic. This is the action that I can have. This is the contribution that I can have, rather than having this gimmicky post that doesn't feel authentic to who I am or what this podcast represents. So this is
Yeah.
definitely going to be an Equal Pay Day podcast. I mean, it's a great
There you go.
example of how, yeah, it's a great example of how, talking about something versus acting on it and using
Yeah.
a wallet that has billions of dollars in it, like Logitech's,
Yeah.
can
I
really
think that's
influence
really
things.
interesting, isn't it? And I think that's really interesting, and it's kind of the unspoken kind of flip side of what I was talking about earlier on about at the moment, and I use that phrase carefully, at the moment, the Edelman research is telling us that consumers trust corporations more than any other institution, and that's quite surprising. But that trust is probably fragile, and
Yeah.
woe betide any company that is doing something that isn't authentic, or is greenwashing or pinkwashing or any other kind of
Yeah.
washing. I think you know it's great that there is that trust there. I think it's great that consumers are saying we will support you if you are doing great things around this. That is all fantastic, but do make sure it's authentic.
If your company is remote or hybrid, then you know just how difficult it can be to grow your company's culture beyond a pre scheduled Zoom happy hour or occasional lunch and learn. Well, this week's sponsor is here to solve that. They're called CultureBot. CultureBot has devised what will likely become the gold standard for growing and blossoming a company culture inside of Slack. The app is like a sidekick for any HR or people professional, automating a lot of the mundane tasks you probably are forgetting to do on a daily basis. Things like birthday and work anniversary celebrations, team shoutouts and kudos, employee introductions, and remote games. It even has health and wellness tips and conversation starters. If that piques your interest, this will get you even more excited. Today, I'm able to share a special promotion for listeners of the podcast. You can get your first 6 months of CultureBot for 50% off. Plus, if your team is under 25 employees, CultureBot is free forever. So if you're looking for a way to create a culture of appreciation and drive increased engagement and togetherness across your team, I definitely recommend checking out CultureBot. Go to getculturebot.com/humanhr. That's getculturebot.com/humanhr to get the offer. Plus, I've added the link in the show notes so you can just click right there. Now, let's get back to the podcast.
Do make
Yeah.
sure it's action based, because otherwise that trust that trust is going
Yeah.
to
Oh,
disappear in a heartbeat.
you are right. It's very fragile. It's like, it's the trust is almost like a sheet of, like, I don't know, ice. Like a thin,
Yeah.
not the kind of
Yeah.
ice you can walk across a lake on, but like a thin sheet of ice that, that cracking sound that it makes when you,
Yeah.
I'm clearly very
Yeah.
stuck in winter here, but the cracking sound that it makes when you step on it. But like, I think that it kind of makes sense that people overall are trusting corporations, because when we see that trust broken, it's like this unbelievable feeling that is out there of like, how could this happen? How could my favorite company be this way? Like,
Yeah.
actually, we saw this with Balenciaga. People trusted Balenciaga as this ultra luxury brand, and then they came out with like child abuse graphics. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, I'm not going to link it. You can look it up. I'm not giving them any more clicks, but this whole thing came out a few months ago about this, and people were up in arms. And so it's interesting that there's this, it's a dichotomy. People have all this trust in companies, but then also it's like, why do they have all this trust in companies if they're not actually seeing the action? We should first see we should, trust that there will be action, expect some action,
Yeah.
and then if there isn't, not be so shocked.
Yeah. 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 No, I think exactly. And one other finding actually from this research was I said corporations were the most trusted, quote unquote, and they were relatively, but when you look at it, the level of trust in corporations was still pretty low. Like I think the wider finding is that consumers aren't massively trusting of anything that's out there now. Media, governments, NGOs. There's a and this is a worrying thing for society, really. But the level of trust is quite low. But I think the really powerful thing, and I say this a little time. I mean, over the last 20 years or so, there's been from sort of grouchy old commentators. There's a lot of sort of much maligned sort of Gen Zs and millennials. And
Mm-hmm.
myself, I'm a very young Gen X. I'm slightly too old for the millennials, so I'm kind of a young Gen X. And
Some
I
people
think
would say you're an elder millennial, potentially.
elder millennial. I'll go with. I'm not sure I like the sound of that either. I'd rather be a young. I'd rather put young in my title. Yeah.
Yeah.
But my point is, I think those generations really have made a difference. That it's been spoken about quite a while about CSR, as you said it, and it's important that companies do the right thing. It's been spoken about, but then I've always worried that the connection between that and where consumers are spending their dollars was a loose one. In fairness to the Gen Zs as consumers and now entering the workforce, millennials are entering management and leadership. Those generations, in a sort of broad stereotype, really do follow through with that, like you said. And I think that's almost going to be good for kind of keeping those organisations to account. That woe
Mm-hmm.
betide you greenwash or pinkwash, woe betide you even look like you're being inauthentic, because they will go somewhere else. I think 20 years
Mm-hmm.
ago we might have said that, but still, oh yeah, I still have to go to company
Yeah.
XYZ. Whereas nowadays, I
Yeah.
think it will actually happen. They will stop supporting you. They will not work for you. And so those generations, they're inheriting the world from Gen Xers, but they're also changing it for Gen
Yes.
Xers actually at the same time.
Yes, I was just speaking with a podcast guest. I don't know if the episode will be before or after ours, but I was just speaking with this person about how incredible Gen Z is at actually being transformational, because there's this like unequivocal sense of, oh, you're not going to meet the expectations that I have or align, our values aren't aligned, I'm out. And there's like
Yeah.
no fear. There's no fear in leaving a job without having a job lined up, which I have never felt in my life. So I really wonder what freedom feels like because I am totally not free of my own fears in that way. Like, I think it's so
Yeah.
incredible. This is officially a Gen Z Stan podcast, I think, because I keep talking about how amazing they are at creating high quality expectations for their employers and for businesses. And I have also, on the other side of things, on this podcast, talked about how we have to cancel culture. A huge part of making change is having discussions, even if we're not happy with the opinion of the other person, or, we feel attacked. Like, we have to be able to speak and we have to be able to have discourse. And so we can't just like cut a company off. And that said, with the exception of Balenciaga, that's where I draw the line when it comes to kids in that way. But, at the end of the day, if people and consumers say to businesses, nope, you broke our trust. We expect you to provide, to procure your equipment or whatever, your products from Black suppliers, from women, from or women businesses, from Black businesses, from businesses that are contributing to gender fairness and gender equality, then, or otherwise we're out, we're not buying from you. Then a business should be like, oh well, thank you for raising this point, let's make some changes and let's show how we've made those changes. It's when
Yeah.
businesses say, oh, we're so sorry, we're going to release this statement because we don't want our profits to be hurt, and then nothing happens, that we really see this issue. So I think all of this to say that, coming back to this point that you made before, that if you were to ask someone, a leader in business, what their gender equality deadline is compared to like their net zero deadline, that they, once they start to be able to say what that due date is, then
Yeah.
we're actually really focused on action. Even if companies don't hit their net zero target by 2030 or 2040, if they're actively working toward it, that's worth just as much. And it's worth a
Yeah.
whole lot more than a company that's like, thank you for letting us know, and then does nothing about it.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think agree with all of that. And I think on gender equality specifically, I've spoken about this quite a bit in the last sort of 6 months or so. And there's also a sort of a miscomprehension that is gender equality even still a thing? I thought we've kind of solved gender equality, haven't we? But the answer is absolutely not, and particularly absolutely not when it comes to economic empowerment. And it's really interesting. Like one example I saw recently, Iceland. Out of all the countries that's closest to gender equality, Iceland, according to the World Economic Forum, Iceland is the closest. And what's really interesting there, they have some rules around paternity leave, new dads, and the leave you can take when you've got a child. And it's exactly the same as the leave the mother can take. It's kind of six
That's
months or nine
wonderful.
months or whatever it might be. And that's amazing. The really interesting thing is that in recent years, I think it's true to say I could have that access in Ireland too. That exists in Ireland as well. But, and this is the big but, what happens in Iceland is that it's societally expected that the dad will take that 6 to 9 months off. I have access to it. Whether I want to take it or not is debatable, but I have access to it. But what would certainly not happen is if I rocked up at work a few weeks later, no one would look at me and say, "Haven't you got a 3-week-old kid? What the hell are you doing here?"
Mm-hmm.
In Iceland, it's got to that societal level of, "I don't want to see you here for the next 6 months. Do not come in. This is, what are you doing? Your job is there." So I think that's the sort of holy grail, really. Policies and procedures and etc. etc. But Iceland have that societal pressure, and that's where it really starts to make a difference. That sort of expected behaviour.
I'm packing my bags and I'm moving to Iceland. And I've been trying to go to Iceland for a vacation recently.
Oh,
And I'm going to have to tell my husband
it's a
this.
cool
He's going to be
country.
like, say,
I've
come again? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I've been there. I've been there before. Never mind all of that stuff, which is amazing. It's also a great country. So yeah, go go go.
That's what I
That's
hear.
that's what I
That's what I
say.
hear. I'll send you a picture when I see the Aurora Borealis. But on this note, you're so right. The societal pressure and the societal expectations, maybe it's not the pressure, but the expectation and the standard is so critical. When you were saying this, I was thinking about what the societal standard is in the US for men and women, or, mothers and fathers. And actually, even mothers are put in working mothers, I should say, are put in a situation where they're expected to return as soon as possible. There is no for example, FMLA, which is a federally it's a federal regulation for job protected leave, says you get 12 weeks if you and your company are eligible. And company eligibility means that you have to have 50 or more employees within a 75-mile radius. And there are some other things, right? And you have had to work at a company for like a year, earning 1,250 hours, like all of these other eligibility parameters. So companies say, oh, we're not eligible for FMLA. Sorry, we don't have anything. You're going to have to go on a leave of absence or, kind of figure it out. And we'll see you back in 8 weeks. If a woman has a cesarean section, the 8 weeks are the exact recovery time. What if she goes out early? I mean, it's
Yeah,
literally there's pressure from the US for women, for mothers not to even continue to be in the workforce. So, if we're really talking about gender equality, we kind of have to start with how we treat our parents. And I have done a couple episodes on this, which I'll link in the show notes for listeners to take a listen to if they haven't yet. But it's really this just dawned on me that Iceland is clearly doing something right if they're focusing on their fathers, because that means that the mothers already are have some kind of protection and expectation to put their family and their new child ahead of
yeah,
the business demand. I think that's amazing.
yeah. And to that exact point, that's like we were talking about earlier on, Tracy. That with this gender fair work we're doing, and we're assessing companies we work with. A lot of it, simple is probably the wrong word, but a lot of it, leaders can change pretty quickly if they want to. If you and
Right.
I are the leaders of an organization, if we decide that, do you know what, we're really not very good with our policy around leave, we're not really not very good with policy around XYZ, we can change that really quickly. And I think it's that's the same idea as Iceland. If more and more organizations do that, then people aren't going to go and work for companies that aren't doing it. It's a bit like that Show the Leave campaign that started recently,
Yes,
and other
yes. That was
aspects.
with
I
the
think,
skim. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I think it's companies that talk about this. It's companies that really make a point of we are being fair. That's when you can start to move the dial. And I think it's true on a country level with Iceland, but it's also true on an organizational level, and high level behind that. Like you said, having this question around, okay, yeah, you're going to be net zero by 2030. That's cool. When are you going to be gender equal, or when are you going to be whatever else? If you start asking those questions as a client of a company, or as anything, I mean, as a thought leader, as you said, or wherever you are, if you start making that a common sort of thought process, you can bet your bottom dollar that companies will start thinking, do you know what, we're really not actually very gender fair around this, or we're really not very open to other underrepresented groups, etc. We need to look at this. I think it needs that catalyst, which is the when are you going to be gender fair? When are you going to be net zero, or whatever else it might be? That conversation needs to start.
Absolutely. I feel so inspired by this conversation because although I am a woman and I'm obviously affected in different ways by being in the workforce and seeing all these conversations around equality and pay and all of these things, I kind of am also like, well, I can do my due diligence to make sure I'm negotiating and I know what salary I, expect and things like that. And I try and it's not to say there's like a card to play, but I really, because there should be an expectation around equality. So I'm not saying that this is like someone playing a card if they're talking about this. By no means am I saying that. But I really try not to bring it up so much in discussion. But actually, one of the best ways that women in business can influence the trajectory of their business's decisions is by talking about the impact that they've had in the workplace. So actually I've been thinking about this kind of in an ass backwards kind of way, so to speak. I'll make this episode a little explicit, but the reality is that if I were to go to my company and say, "Hey, I want to have children one day. This leave isn't going to cut it." Just as an example, this is not a real life thing, but you know, as an example, I want to have 16 weeks of leave. Anything less than that is totally asinine. Then and a company leader's like, "Whoa, wait, I'm not sure I agree. Why do you feel this way?" Then you're having a discussion, right? You're having a
Yeah,
discussion about something that otherwise wouldn't have happened. And similarly with procurement, if you're in a role like yourself, head of procurement, and you're like, "Wait a second, why aren't we focused on bringing suppliers to the fold who are black owned, who are women owned, who are committed to the gender fair coalition or other things connected to the UN? Why aren't we doing that? We should be." Like, it's through the
yeah,
conversation where changes can
yeah.
happen. So I'm really inspired by this.
Do you know what would be even more amazing than what you just said? Would be if a prospective dad went to their company leadership and said, "Hey,
Yeah.
I want to be a dad sometime soon. This
Right.
leave is a that would, I mean, that would shift the paradigm completely, wouldn't it? About the
Yes.
about if it was a man raising that topic.
Yes, you know what? This is there's a whole idea I have here now about like where are the dads? Let's find the dads, find the guys, the people who want to be dads one day, who have always wanted kids, because it's not just mothers or prospective mothers who have always wanted kids. There are people out there who have always wanted kids regardless of their gender. Let's have like there should be conversations around that. How are businesses providing support? Even, infertility benefits are a huge miss with companies. There's a guest that I'm going to
Yeah,
have on later this year who is really focused on this, but I mean, I would say probably 8 out of 10 people do not have access to infertility benefits, whether regardless of their gender. Because infertility is not just placed on the woman or the prospective mother. So there are so many avenues where if someone of the opposite gender, a prospective father, jumps into the conversation and says, "Yeah, I don't want just 6 weeks. I don't want just 8 weeks. I want to actually see my kid like hit these milestones and grow up so that I can be part of their lives in a different way." I mean, if we've been able to change business this far by saying we demand remote work and flexibility and whatever
yeah,
else, we can demand that. We can expect that.
yeah. I think exactly, and it goes back to that sort of point about we can all do something, and I think my own experiences around looking to drive the sort of gender equality um, progress with our procurement spend. It's quite often I've been asked questions about, well, you're a privileged middle-aged white guy. Why are you looking to drive forward gender equality? Do you have any daughters, or why are you looking to? And I don't. I have three. I have three sons, and I think I get why people are thinking like that, but
Hmm.
it's all too often with these topics on gender. And I saw some content recently around looking to get more minority representation in certain professions, and there's
Hmm.
almost this human nature angle of what can I do to help that? I'm a privileged white guy. What can I do to help gender equality? What can I do to help other minorities or underrepresented groups? It's kind of a redundant question because we can all do something, and everything being equal, a privileged middle-aged white guy can probably do way more than most people can to progress these causes.
Yes.
The idea of, but why are you doing it? Because you're a man. You've got three boys. You haven't even got these daughters. It's kind of a weird. It's kind of a weird line of questioning, really.
It is. And you know what? It makes me think about how exhausting it is when you are that minority group or that underrepresented group and you have to be the one to fight for change. This is the same discussion that we have with colleagues who are black or brown, and they're like, well, I don't want to be the one to explain to you why I feel this way or
Yeah,
how how this impacts
and
me.
nor should
And
they.
they're right.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's the exact same thing. As a woman, I don't want to be the one to have to make the change. It would be
yeah,
great if a middle-aged white man was like, we have to make this change. I have so many friends who are pregnant or trying to get pregnant, and they do not have access to leave because they're not FMLA eligible or their company is not, or where their husbands are not don't have access, excuse me, to leave. And anytime they call me on the phone or they tell me this, I'm absolutely horrified that that my friends who are women in these instances are not able to have peace of mind when it comes to either starting their family or beginning the process to start their family, and same for their husbands. So I think this is now a David Latin Stan account as well, because I think it is fabulous that you are the person impacting or working to impact these changes, because if it's not coming from you, then it's falling on those who are tired and just don't want to fight the good fight anymore.
yeah, yeah. Do you know a really big practical example of that? And I found this very surprising. Logitech work with UN Women as part of their Generation Equality campaign. That's their flagship campaign to drive forward to try and
Cool.
get to that equality by 2030. We work. We're commitment makers to their campaign there. They did an event in New York around the UN General Assembly Week, and they were looking for speakers, and they were really keen for Bracken Darrell, our CEO, to speak at that. And he was really excited about it too, but his travel plans were just hectic. And it was at one point I was worried that he wouldn't be able to make it. And I was sort of saying to the team at UN Women, we're really trying to get it sorted, but we're not sure he can make it. And they were really disappointed. And what they hopefully they don't mind me sharing this, but what they said to me was, we're really excited to have Bracken speak at our event, because bearing in mind this is UN Women, this isn't
Hmm.
Tracy and David's consulting, as I mentioned. This is UN Women, a
Yeah,
serious,
it's major.
well-known global institution. UN Women said to me, "We're really excited to have Bracken speak because we've never had a white male tech CEO talk about gender at one of our events." UN
That's
Women said
amazing.
that,
That's
which is
amazing.
gobsmacking, really. Now, thankfully, he
Wow.
could make it, and it was great and everything. But what was amazing to me was that UN Women said that we haven't had a white male tech CEO talk about gender.
It's amazing
Now,
and
they have.
concerning all at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
wow. Well, he should be really proud of himself for being, a leader in this space, in having the discussions that have to happen and making the changes that have to happen. And again, everyone can talk about what they're going to do, but not everyone actually does something. Like everyone talks about that they want to start a podcast, but not everyone does it. Everyone says that they want to continue their
yeah,
podcast, and not everyone does, right? So it's, whatever way that we want to look at this, we can justify and reason and understand logically what this looks like. But it sounds like
yeah,
Logitech is doing an incredible job of really putting their money where it matters. And money, I mean, listen, it's money that makes the change. Like any people can say that it's other stuff, and that certainly contributes, like, compassion and consideration contributes and makes it feel even better, but it's really money that influences the way the world works.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's exactly it, Tracy, and that's kind of the big idea, really. That we've had a great conversation about a whole load of different topics without I've been speaking about the something. I don't think I've even really told anyone what Logitech's something is yet, or what my procurement something is anyway. And it's exactly that. I think what procurement teams have ultimately, for those that aren't in procurement, is we're this really interesting pivot point between the internal teams, what they need, their strategies, and then the external solution providers, suppliers essentially. And from that pivot point, we have a huge amount of influence. Essentially, we're talking with these suppliers that we may well spend millions of dollars with. And we've always used that influence to get kind of the best suppliers we can work with to give us really good performance, really good partnership, and the right price. Like I said, I mean, of course we do that. And that's the
Sure.
influence we have, it, the bedrock of procurement. And I think the simple big idea is, what if we really use that influence to drive forward equality? I think procurement has driven forward equality for many years. The traditional answer to it is supplier diversity, as you mentioned earlier, that you try and work with as many small, minority-owned, women-owned, other underrepresented groups as possible. That's fantastic, but you'll never get all of your spend to be that.
Right.
Large companies have a tendency to spend big with other large companies. Supplier
Mhm.
diversity struggles to impact them. My something, or what we're trying to make a more global something, is, yeah, when you're a big business and you're spending millions with another big business, ask them, well, how fair are you? How diverse are you? How gender equal are you? and
Right.
and they will listen when a client asks that. They listen to me to a point, and this is the thing, I guess, that's what we're doing. The whole coalition idea comes from, there's only so much impact Logitech have. Some suppliers may not pick up the phone, others might sort of do the math and think, yeah, do you know what, we're not really keen on doing this. It's okay to maybe ruffle Logitech's feathers. We might get away with that. But what wouldn't happen is if there were another 10 or 15 Davids that were asking that same question. Hey, before we spend a few $1 million with you, we want to make sure that you're taking this gender fair assessment. If there was this breadth of impact, like there are more and more companies asking that question, and perhaps even more excitingly, that depth of impact. When I say depth, I mean, if 6 companies were asking the same company, hey guys, we want you to take this assessment, they will not say no. That they will absolutely have to take it. You're getting to that point of making it a requirement, and that's the big idea, really, I guess, that trying to sort of amplify Logitech something and my procurement something within Logitech, trying to amplify that to its biggest possible impact. Is There's lots of things that happen as standard in procurement. Large organizations ask other large organizations lots of questions: contractual, legal stuff, data compliance, privacy, data security, and that's all really important. What we don't ask as a default is, are you living up to the UN Women Empowerment Principles? Are you gender fair? Ultimately, we want to make that a standard, and then that's how you can unlock that power. Like you say, I mean, Logitech, we have a lot of supplier spend relative to some other companies, but we're not a massive multinational. But if you had 25 big companies saying, we're not going to work with you unless you take this assessment, but not only that, put in place a plan to improve each year,
Mhm.
the impact you can have there is extraordinary. I mean, I work closely with our internal community and advocacy DEI team, and in a way, I'm trying to sort of progress some of our own values externally, and I think that's the huge power of it, isn't it? That
Yeah.
internal policies, you can do wonderful things with your employees, but you soon hit a ceiling of, we only have 10 employees or 100 or 5,000
Right.
or whatever it might be. If you can influence the whole ecosystem, the impact you can have there is enormous. So if I allow myself a
Absolutely.
bold aim, that's what we're trying to do.
I think it's amazing. I think it's amazing. And I could truly speak to you about this for hours. And I have to stop myself because otherwise I will. And I mean, I'm really, like I said, I'm super, super inspired by what you're doing, what Logitech is committed to, the big idea, and this whole conversation. And I'm really glad that we are releasing this on Equal Pay Day because it just is so fitting. And on top of that, I think that if a company like Logitech has committed to, making these changes or, inspiring these the way forward or the standard, then it's just a matter of time, hopefully, until other companies realize that if they don't do the same thing, they're going to lose market share. And
Yeah,
that's what it
yeah.
has to come down to. So I really appreciate everything that you're doing and that your colleagues are doing to make the world a better place and have a good impact on the world one step at a time. And with that, I'd love for you to share with the listeners who are hopefully equally as inspired by your insights where they can reach out to you if they want to learn more.
Sure. Yeah. No, I'll be greedy for a moment, Tracy, and I'll do that. But I suppose to not like big ideas can be scary in terms of where do you start. And I think the
Mm.
critical thing I'd love people to think about is everyone can do something. As I say, what is your something? Think about that. Really think about it in terms of you and your organization. Go to your leadership with it, and then critically, just do it. It could be a small thing, could be a big thing, whatever it could be. Just do it. That's all. And if it's around similar topics that we're doing, then absolutely, I'd love to connect with any and all of you. If that's something you can do, then you can get me at LinkedIn. There's actually a landing page for the Coalition for Gender Fair Procurement. We've launched genderfairprocurement.com. I guess we'll share the link as well.
Yeah.
Please do reach out there. You'll reach the Coalition team. But I think more broadly than that, what is your something? Go do it. If it is progressing gender, particularly by your procurement spend, then we'd love to have as many allies doing this as possible. Reach out to me on LinkedIn or that Coalition website, like I say. But more broader than that, we all have to do something, frankly, but we all can do something. What is your something? That's all I'd encourage people to really think. And if it aligns with where my team and I are going, then I'd love to talk to all of you.
Thank you so much, David, for all of that and for being on the podcast. I'm sure we'll continue the conversation, hopefully.
No, thanks, Tracy. Real pleasure to be here. And yeah, thank you for speeding up the release. That's really appreciated.
Oh, yeah. It's a perfect time. Who needs June when we've got Equal Pay Day coming up?
Yeah, and we need action. We need action now, not in June too.
Right, exactly. I should just release this tonight. I'm ready to go.
Yeah, that sounded like a procurement negotiation, but it wasn't really.
Yeah, right. We can pretend. We can pretend. But no, seriously, David, thank you so much, and we'll have to have you back on one day.
No, thank you, Tracy, and thanks everyone for listening.
Hey, just before you go, don't forget to subscribe to the show so that you are the first to hear when an episode drops each week. And maybe leave a 5-star review and a comment about how much you loved this episode. Plus, if you have someone in mind who would really enjoy this episode, make sure you share it with them. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week.